Hi. Montage M is Yamaha's latest flagship synth. It builds on the existing popular Montage platform and adds significantly enhanced hands-on controls with new encoders and an extra parameter display, a new virtual analog style synth engine on top of the existing sample and FM engines, up to 400 voice polyphony, which means plenty of split and layer capabilities, expanded sample content and user sample storage area, and more touch-ups here and there. There are plenty of sound demos out there already, so in this video I'll take a look at what's new compared to the previous Montage and MOdX line, what the Montage workflow is like, and pros and cons compared to the competition. Before I start, a quick disclosure, I got the M8x directly from Yamaha. It cost me quite a bit in import fees and taxes, but still substantially less than retail. Beside that, no money changed hands, they have no say over the content of this video, and don't get to see it before it's published. This channel is funded mainly by viewers who subscribe to exclusive content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and price check affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Okay, let's start with what's new in this series of keyboards. Montage M comes in 3 flavors, the M6 and M7 with synth action style keybeds and 5 and 6 octaves respectively, and this, the massive 88 key version with weighted keys and polyphonic aftertouch, meaning that it detects the pressure you apply to each key individually, giving you control over how the timbre evolves on a per note basis, assuming the patch was designed to detect polyphonic aftertouch. This is as opposed to the M6 and M7 where pressure on any single key applies across the keybed. The aftertouch travel is relatively shallow, about 2 millimeters for the white keys, and about 1 millimeter for the black keys. And it's implemented really nicely in a way that even if you get to maximum velocity, you still have room to apply the aftertouch. Regardless of polyphonic aftertouch, by the way, the M8x's keybed feels very good. I invited a friend who plays the piano on a regular basis to try it out, and he said the feel of the keys is very realistic and similar to the action of a real piano. Setting the keyboard and action aside, all 3 in the M series have identical synth capabilities and sounds. At the time of the making of this video, there's no lower end, more affordable and lighter MOdX style version of these synths. There's no indication from Yamaha if a cheaper version will come around. In the last iteration, MOdX came out 2 years after the original Montage, so it may take a while. Another big new thing for the Montage M series is a new third synth engine called ANX, a 3 oscillator dual filter virtual analog synth. This comes in addition to the sample-based AWM2 engine and the 8-operator FM engine called FMX. I'll dive deeper into ANX's features later in this video, as well as cover AWM and FMX. Another important thing that's new in Montage M is how much more hands-on it is. You've got 6 new endless encoders under the screen, these control parameters that are highlighted on the touch screen above them. So for example, now I'm controlling this row, and I can go down to control this one as well. This is a huge improvement over the previous workflow where you'd need to select a parameter and then edit it using this dial or these buttons. These encoders, by the way, are extremely well designed. I think you can control them with a very fine resolution if you want, and with a quick turn can go through the entire scale very easily. Same applies to these. Very easy to go from fine to quick control. And then the second major hands-on improvement is the new parameter display on the left. You now get a screen to see which parameters you're editing, and the buttons on top help you select different tabs. And then you can also navigate into sub-pages using the page buttons. The screen buttons and encoders have 4 modes. You either control parameters for the selected part. Multi-part gives you access to mixer-style controls across multiple parts. Groove lets you apply swing and MIDI effects to sequencer patterns as they play back. And then assign gives you access to both part and common macros for different live sets. And you can customize the names of these macros. Notice the display here is different whether I'm looking at performance level functions or part level functions. There's a lot of overlap between the parameters you can edit on the sub-display and the main display. So the sub-display is way more hands-on. The disadvantage here is that you can only see 8 parameters at a time, and you can't access all the parameters that are available on the main screen. If you want to see all the parameters for a given tab, just hit page dump and it'll throw that tab onto the main screen along with any additional parameters you can edit there. And it goes the other way around too. So let's say if I want to edit the arpeggios, shift and page jump will throw that page onto the sub-display. A nice advantage of the sub-display is that you can focus on something, say the filter envelope. This will now remain fixed here regardless of where I travel on the main screen. The sub-screen is LCD but has pretty good viewing angles. The main screen is a resistive touch screen like the ones on the MODX and Montage, but it does have a faster response. It does seem to be less precise maybe than a capacitive touchscreen, and at least currently you can't grab a parameter and drag it. So you'll still need to either first select or turn the data dial or just edit this way. It would be nice if they'd just let you drag and drop these around. Moving on with what's new, since montage menus can get quite deep, Yamaha have added a new navigation button. This both shows you where you were using this little "You are here" pin and gives you quick access to various synth components. It also gives you a really nice idea for the signal flow for the different synth engines. The new ANX engine, the sample-based engine, and the FM engine. It also gives you a good idea of the effects signal chain, both part and performance effects, and is just generally speaking a quick way to get to where you want to go. The super knob has also received a few improvements. For those of you not familiar with a super knob, it's basically a master macro knob that controls the 8 performance assigns. These in turn are a form of macro inception because they control part assigns. So these are the macros for part 1, the macros for the entire performance, and the uber macro, the one knob to control them all. Anyway, if this does too much, you can always disable specific assigns. And the super knob now has 3 morph points instead of just 2. So for example, let's say if I wanted, when the super knob is here, for this to be all the way up and these 2 or these 3 to be all the way down, then I would just hit shift and program the left point. And then let's say around the midpoint, I'd want this to be up and these to be down. So that's the midpoint. And then on the right point, have these 2 up, shift right. So now the super knob will morph from these 2 to the one in the middle to the one on the left, which sounds like this. Beside that, you've got plenty more super knob LED patterns, some to help you express what's going on in your performance. For example, going from maybe relatively stable to wild. And you can turn the blinking off. I know some people are worried about that. By the way, the super knob also has its own motion sequencer, so if you don't have a hand free to automate it, you can turn on super knob automation. And you edit its automation or motion sequence here, and it can get pretty complex with multiple automation shapes and types and sequences. More on motion sequencing later, by the way. Another thing that's new on the M series is its expanded polyphony. You now get a total of 400 voices, 128 using the factory sample engine, another 128 using user samples, another 128 using the FM engine, and then 16 more using the new virtual analog ANX engine. This means you can get pretty creative in terms of how you combine various splits and layers to create multi-timbral, multi-layered, evolving soundscapes. This is a factory preset, by the way, made by Ben Jordan, if I'm not mistaken. And And there are literally thousands of these to explore here. I think over 3,000. Another important thing that's new here is the number of elements you can combine in a single sample-based part. Previously, a sample-based part could only have up to 8 elements. Elements are things like different velocity layers or keyboard regions or key on and off sounds. Anyway, previously your performance parts would fill up pretty quickly if you wanted to use an instrument that had more than 8 elements. And the wildest one I saw here, I think, is this one with 67 elements for a single part. So all the other parts are muted now. It's just this one part that, as you can see, based on velocity, will strum or play a chord. You can, of course, explore these elements individually. If you like, you can get to the first 8 elements just by hitting these buttons, shifting these buttons, and the others using this little drop-down menu. So a pretty wild one, I think. Each of these can either be a different sample or occupy a different section of the keyboard, be triggered by a different velocity. It's a bit hard to see under this menu, or be triggered at a different timing. That's what, in this case, makes that strumming effect. A few other things that are new here. The left-hand controller has been improved, more features on the touch strip, a nice keyboard hold function that acts kind of like a global sustain pedal, hands-on portamento controls. And the last major thing that's new in Montage M is the internal storage, both with factory content now increased from 5.7 gigs to almost 10 gigs, and space for user presets. Sample space increased from 1.7 to 3.8 gigs of user samples, which you can use to bring in either third-party or your own multi-sampled instruments. So for example, here I sampled Native Instruments Una Corda. The audition button plays way better than me, by the way. So what this has is 4 velocity layer samples, multi-sampled every 6 semitones using Sample Robot. And that takes up only 60 megabytes of storage, so plenty left either for a more detailed multi-sample or for other instruments. From a connectivity perspective, Montage M has the main headphone output, 2 1/4-inch stereo balanced outputs, as well as 2 additional assignable balanced outputs. It also has 2 1/4-inch inputs to route audio in, and you can apply effects to this audio, including a vocoder effect, as well as using an envelope follower, use it as a mod source. Then you've got 4 foot switch/controller inputs. There's 5-pin MIDI in, out, and through. Montage M has 2 USB Type-A host ports, which you can use to connect MIDI controllers or storage, and then a USB Type-B port for data transfer, MIDI, and multi-channel audio. You've got 32 channels out, assignable, and 6 in, and there's a class-compliant mode, so you can use this with an iPad too, or without installing a driver on your computer. There's no computer control or librarian software available currently, but Yamaha have announced they'll make a full software version of the synth available free to owners sometime in 2024. So those are the main things that are new in Montage M. Let's take a look at how all of these come together in its workflow. And for that, you need to be acquainted with a few terms. On the top level are set lists. These are basically sets of shortcuts that you can put together that link to performances. And as you can hear, there's seamless sound transitions between the performances. I think that applies to all performances that don't have more than 8 parts. And now with up to 128 elements per sample part, that shouldn't be too much of a limitation. Anyway, so set lists are links to performances, and you can move between performances by pressing these buttons too. So say if you're in a different menu and want to swap out performances, it's pretty easy to do that through here. You can also search for performances, and again, either select categories here or on screen, or just use the search. Anyway, a performance is the name for the overall combination of instruments, splits, layers, recorded patterns, and any modulation and arpeggiator assignments to those splits and layers. Basically everything that changes as you go from performance to performance. Since there are so many layers in a performance, as you browse through the performances, say by category, let's go back into all here, you can audition these very quickly, or press the audition button to get an idea of what's going on in a performance. Performances will often have scenes, so you could have different sections of your song be different performances if the sections are entirely different, but if they use similar instruments, then scenes can turn on and off various components. We'll dive into that a bit deeper later on, but say for example, add a beat, or change other parameters So scenes will help you toggle between various settings within a single performance. Anyway, that's the performance layer. So for example, the scenes and parts live in the common layer of a performance. Then you can dive in to edit individual parts, either by pressing a part and the edit button, or just quickly selecting common and part using these buttons. You can always exit back home. Anyway, once you select a performance, you can see its parts, and parts live a level under a performance. Typically, you'll use parts for layers or splits, though they can also be muted in and out based on scenes in your song. A part can only use one sound engine at a time. So for example, we've got a few AWM parts here, an ANX part. Performances can have up to 8 parts that can be keyboard controlled. And then you can add additional parts, 9 through 16. You'll lose seamless sound switching, like I mentioned. You can trigger these parts using external MIDI. So parts live under performances, and then under parts are elements, which you access by selecting a part and hitting edit. Aside from the navigation button that tells you where you are, another important navigation element are these 2 buttons on top. So if it just says common on top, you're editing performance parameters. When you dive in to edit a part, you can edit part common parameters. This means you're on the part level, and then when you dive in, either by pressing this button and choosing an element, or by using shift an element like I showed you earlier, this then indicates that you're editing on the element level. It's important to know which level you're at, not just in terms of navigation, but also in terms of the layer, because different things apply to different layers. For example, you may have an element LFO, element EQ, or element envelopes, which obviously apply to elements. Then you might have common mod sources and destinations that apply to the entire performance, or mod sources and destinations on the part level. That's probably the biggest learning curve within Montage, understanding which elements of the operating system applies to which layers. So for example, arpeggios live on a per part basis. Scenes are performance level parameters. Motion sequencers also live on the part level, but can dive in sometimes and modulate element parameters. Then one more thing in terms of navigation, the display mode will show you different aspects of parts, and the view modes are different views into what's going on in your performance. Setting up splits and layers using this screen, I think, is pretty straightforward. You can choose a start and end note for each part just by pressing here and then using either the data dial or the keyboard. Same goes for velocity layers, but there's also a super beginner split mode where you can choose up to 3 split points and choose which part plays on which split. Up to you. I kind of prefer this overview mode more. One of the interesting ways to explore and customize the factory performances is to swap out their arpeggio patterns. So say if we go in to edit this part, you can see it's using this arpeggio pattern, but there are over 10,000 of these in here. In different categories. So, yeah, quite a lot to go through. And you can choose different attributes. That's what these little ARP initials mean as well. So a note ARP will play an entire pattern if you press a single note. And then a chord pattern will require you to hold more than one note to get a pattern going. And then M, or main, means that it's for the main part of the song, the intro, the fill, and then A, B, C, and so on are different variations. If you just want a simple pattern, look for oct. So these are kind of like the more traditional ARP patterns. I think it would be nice if they'd have regular arpeggio controls here as well. But again, ARPs here can do way more than just this. ARPs are also used here to program drum patterns, and for that you need to load up a kit. A quick way to do that is just hit Shift and Rhythm Pattern, and you can start exploring different kits. And once you've chosen your kit, you can then go ahead and edit the arpeggiator or the pattern for that kit. And maybe we'll also increase the tempo a little bit to make things a bit more interesting. Okay, back into here, edit, arps. So if you like, you can swap out arpeggiator patterns for other arpeggiator drum patterns. Okay, I didn't say all of them were good. Okay, now, once you've chosen your patterns, you can choose up to 8 different patterns per part. And you can use these in different scenes. So each part can store 8 arpeggiator patterns for use within different scenes. There's a lot of features I won't cover here. You can turn on and off holds per part. You can turn arpeggiators on or off entirely if you want. And you can also create your own complex rhythmic or strumming arpeggiators. There is, however, no step sequencer for that, so you'll need to use the regular pattern sequencer. So you could, for example, play in your own arpeggiator pattern, whether note or drums, and then convert that to a user arpeggio. Moving on, let's talk about scenes. Like I mentioned earlier, they let you activate or deactivate different settings within a single performance. For example, as you can see here, change different mutes and levels within a performance. It's very easy to change whatever you want and then save it as a new scene using Shift and the scene button. So now these values are stored within the scene. For more control on what's stored within a scene or not, go into the scene. You can turn various items on or off. So for example, if I didn't want a scene change to swap out the ARP or the motion sequencer, then I could do that. And the things that you control within a scene are ARPs, motion sequencers, super knob, mix controls, which parts are controlled by the keyboard, envelopes, and ARP and motion sequencer play effects. Let's move on and talk about effects. I'll choose a simple performance with just one part. Effects also live on multiple levels, meaning elements, part, and performance. There are a few basic effects controls on the per element level. So let's say choose one of these here. Depends on whether you want to call these sound design or effects, but there's filter, for example, on the sample level, EQ, and an LFO. Then on the part level, so part common, you've got 4 effects. 2 constant and 2 configurable. There's a 3-band EQ that leads in to 2 insert effects and then out to a 2-band EQ. Don't know why they put that here in this order, but if you go to navigation, you can get an overview of the signal chain. So these are the part effects, and then you've got 4 performance level effects, 2 sends, so you can send audio from any part to the global reverb, and another variable effect, which can be one of multiple effects types, not just reverb. So these performance level effects are 2 send effects. Then you've got 2 master insert effects, another configurable M effects. Again, multiple options here. And then finally, a master EQ. So say if I wanted to add a delay insert effect just to this piano part, I'd go ahead, go into here, look for the delays. Here we are. And there are a bunch of delay effect options with presets. And dry wet control. Moving on, let's talk about mixing. You can mix using the Mix tab, but I think a nicer way to get hands-on is using the multi-part controls. So for example, edit panning for the different performance parts. Levels, obviously, you can control through here. Same goes for mutes and solos. You can do it like this, but it's easier just to mute and solo using these buttons. And you can also use these to control the level of the first 8 elements of a part. Okay, let's dive deeper and take a look at the synth engines, and I'll start with the ANX engine. For a global overview, you've got 3 oscillators and a noise generator going into a mixer, then going into 2 filters actually. And as you can see, a bunch of LFOs and envelopes to control everything. You can use these menus and tabs to edit the various elements and common controls for the ANX engine, but I think that it's much more convenient here, and this will let us bring up the scope on this screen. So, like I mentioned, 3 oscillators, multiple shapes, 4 the oscillators, and a pulse width for each, not just for the square wave. And of course, you can modulate this. And then there's also a wave shaper for these, for a wave folder effect. So it depends which wave you're editing. Let's get this back to a saw. By the way, if you want to fine-tune a parameter, you can use Shift. Let's get this back to 50. Oh, good. You've got oscillator sync, which isn't dependent on the other oscillators. And of course, you can modulate this too. Octave controls. And pitch fine-tuning. You've got one control here for FM and ring mod. And if we throw this over here, you'll see a few more parameters here. For example, that ring and FM level are 2 separate controls. And of course, the beauty of this engine is that it has 3 oscillators. So we can bring in oscillator 2. So maybe pitch oscillator 2. Tune this back down. Nice, oscillator 3. Back to our scope. So no lack of heft here. The 4th oscillator is a noise generator, if you want that. There are envelopes and various pitch controls, along with pitch bend, and then dual filters, multi-mode filters. Let's take a listen to the low-pass filter with resonance. Not particularly crunchy resonance, but there is a drive feature. I'll get to that soon. There are 2 filters. There are a few filter types. So maybe like this. So different slopes. If you want to see what these are exactly, let's do page jump. You can see the different types. And don't forget, we're feeding a filter into a filter. So if we want, we can cut off the lows with resonance, which is cool. Or apply different filter types here too. Or just disable it entirely, put it in through mode. You can edit all these parameters on both screens or use these knobs. So plenty of options there. While we're here, there's also a drive option. This is what you want. Dual controls. There's drive for both filters, by the way. So if we turn this on, and choose this, so filter 2 has drive as well. I won't go through all the subtractive synthesis options here, but there are the usual suspects. One thing I did notice is that while you can choose individual depth for each of the filters using the filter LFO or filter envelopes, if you use the motion sequencer, you control both filters together. Then beside that, you've got access to part effects here with nice visualization here. for the different effect types, which is cool. And no shortage of effects here. These are the standard effects, by the way. So the standard insert effects that you can apply to any part, not just to the ANX engine. Then a couple more things I wanted to show you. You've got a unison function. Goes up to 4. And let's move this here. Also, voltage drift and aging. Both of these will add an even more extreme analog feel. So that's the ANX engine. I'm going to disable keyboard control of that. Let's talk about the sample-based AWM2 engine. These are just the init presets for both. Sounds like a simple piano, or there's also a drum version of this. Let's maybe load up a more interesting part. I already talked earlier about how the different elements are used here. I think the sub-display is a little bit less useful for sample-based parts just because there's so much going on here. Anyway, on a per element basis, you can load up a sample from the USB drive if you've got one connected, or just browse through the many built-in factory sounds, again by category or subcategory. So I just swapped out one of the layers of the piano with an RD, with an electric piano. I won't go through all of the sample settings because there are plenty of tutorials about this online. What I will say though is that each element can actually contain multiple samples if you want to treat them similarly within the element. So for example, if I go to my una corda multisample, then go ahead and edit that and take a look at its elements, you can see that this element 3 and the other elements are actually a bunch of waveforms, a bank of waveforms. So for each velocity, I've got multiple key banks, and all of these live within a single element. So it's pretty wild how deep the sample engine can go here in terms of splits and layers. Most of that editing you'll do here, as opposed to here, which gives you more basic controls. Drum parts are fairly similar, a bit simpler. Again, you go into a part, you edit it, and then just choose the key that you want to swap out within the kit, and choose the sample that you want that key to play. You can select keys using the keyboard and start browsing through the thousands of samples in here. Or just bring in your own. Then the final engine we need to talk about is the FMX engine. Here too, you'll probably be doing the bulk of the editing within the screen, but there are a few interesting sub-display perks here. So let's go in here and edit this. Now, a full tutorial of FM synthesis is way beyond the scope of this video, and self-promotion alert. There's a great one in my book on Patreon, but generally speaking, the idea is that you've got 8 oscillators in various configurations called algorithms. Some of these can be heard. Those are the oscillators or operators on the bottom row. So 1, 2, and 8 in this algorithm, or 4 and 8 in this algorithm. And then the other oscillators or operators fed in the back are sort of wave shapers, or basically frequency modulators for the operators, the carriers that we can hear. So that's where this comes in nicely. For example, in this algorithm, we can hear the level of operators 4 and 8. This is operator 8. We can bring up operator 4 and then maybe change its frequency ratio. So now we can hear both operators separately. And then to have operator 7 do something to 8 or 3 do something to 4, we need to increase their level. So let's go back to level and start messing with operator 8 using operator 7 and operator 4 using 3, and we can change their relative frequency. Let's maybe just fine tune this a bit so it doesn't beat as much. Anyway, changing the relative frequency of the modulating operator gets us these interesting and dissonant, sometimes, FM timbres. Anyway, the reason I mentioned all this is that if you load up an FM patch, let's just load up a preset and go ahead and search just for FMX patches, and maybe not limit ourselves just to pianos. So once you go through these and say find something you like, let's go with this. We can go in to edit the sound, and without knowing anything about FM synthesis, just play around with operator levels to get different timbres or tones. And I would also go to the color tab and play with those. Maybe not play with texture too much. So a lot to explore here just with these 3 parameters and relative frequencies and relative levels without really knowing much about FM synthesis. Speaking of exploring FM, if you go ahead and add FM sounds into part 9 through 16, so let's go into here, 9, you can explore the smart morph function. So let's do that. Let's make sure, yeah, we're in FM sounds, and just load up, let's start with this one, for example, and then maybe add another one here. That took 2 parts, by the way. Let's go with something totally different, maybe a string. This has 4 parts, so it may be chaotic. So if you look for one more that's only 1 part. Toy piano, 1 part. Anyway, I have no idea what's going to happen now, but if we go to Smart Morph and hit Analyze, then we can now surf through what is an amalgamation of those different sounds that I loaded up. So you need to be in a mood to be experimental with this feature, but if you browse and tap around this surface, you just might find something that sounds good. You can also create a path through these, which you can travel through using the super knob. And like I showed you earlier, you can also automate the super knob using motion sequencing, which is a good segue into the topic of motion control. Motion control in montage lingo is using physical controls like the super knob or assign buttons or a motion sequencer or even envelope followers to control various synth parameters. Assignments to control parameters can be made either the easy way or the hard way. I know which you'd like to hear. Regardless, let's start with the easy way. So the easy way is to first find the parameter you'd like to control. Let's say, for example, the oscillator sync parameter. And once you edit that parameter only on the touchscreen for some reason, the control assign button will light up with excitement to let you know that yes, you can assign a control to this, and then just press the button and either choose a motion sequence lane or envelope follower here, or just touch the control. So let's say that I wanted to use the mod wheel to control oscillator sync. Making an assignment is just as easy as that, and we're taken directly into the mod matrix screen or the control assign screen, which shows you that we've now assigned the mod wheel to oscillator sync. There are a few additional controls here. We can choose to have this bipolar, or unipolar. There's the mod depth, that's ratio. Then there's a curve parameter, which changes based on the curve we choose, and there are a bunch of pretty wacky curves in here. Let's maybe take this out. So you can see this is a curve, or let's go for a crazy one. Say this one, that's a curve. And these have different parameters based on the curve, which changes, I guess, the curve of the curve. And you can also create a user curve if you wanted to. And there are pretty cool ones here. Let's say we choose the harmonic one. So this, for example, is aimed at harmonic intervals, which is pretty cool, even if we just point it to pitch, not even sync. Anyway, so that's one way of making an assignment, just touching a parameter, and if the control assign button lights up, then it's good news. We can make the assignment here, for example. We can't. Another way of making assignments is by source. So hold Shift, Control Assign, then choose the mod source, again, either by tapping on the screen, the motion sequencer, or the envelope follower, or just touch one of the controls. So let's say go for assign number 1 within the part assign. Again, we go to the mod matrix, add a destination, and choose any one of the available destinations that we want to control with the assign knob. By the way, if you're in the mod matrix and you choose auto select, then it will automatically jump to the mod slots related to the controller you touch. The assign buttons are also controls that you can use as sources, as is the ribbon, of course. Now, the element LFOs and envelopes are relatively limited because they can only connect to whatever they're allowed to connect to directly here. For more extensive modulation options, you'll want to use the motion sequencer. So let's first turn off this LFO depth and not use it. And again, shift lets us fine tune this. So motion sequencing, you've got 4 motion sequencing lanes per part. Note that you can only use 8 per performance, so don't turn these on unless you need them. You turn motion sequencing on or off for the entire performance using this button. You can see I've already triggered the motion sequencer here. And you can also trigger the motion sequencer, by the way, using the motion sequencer trigger button. You can have it loop or not. And here we go. So it's just triggered and I'll play once. You can change the length. Let's say make it just 2 steps. And let's also assign this to something. So go into the filter, cutoff, and hit control assign. Motion sequencer lane 1. So now we've got our 2-step motion sequence going, let's say in inverse. And this is a good example of why it's useful to have 2 screens. I can control the filter on the sub display. Okay, back into the motion sequencer. These are our 2 steps. We can edit the sequence. Then you've got 2 curves to choose from, either A or B. You can edit the mod depth here, by the way, as well. Change the direction if you like. And choose the pulse shape, of which there are quite a few. You can see that peeking in through here. And if that wasn't enough, you could use user curves as well and edit those in here. So those are the motion sequencers. And then the third interesting mod source here is the envelope follower. I think the fastest way to show this is, let's turn on control here, go into rhythm patterns and just pick one. Maybe get the tempo a bit faster. Not that fast. Yeah, let's go with this. Then hit envelope follower, turn it on, and maybe turn the level of the drums down. So the idea here is to use the level of the drums, which the envelope follower follows, to modulate the level of the synth. And you can play with the parameters to set the mod depth levels to taste. And if you want to see the input into the envelope follower and its output, you can check that out on this screen. Okay, the last major aspect of Montage M I want to cover before I head out to the pros and cons is sequencing and creating songs from within Montage beyond just performing with arps or scenes. Nothing has changed here compared to the original Montage and MODX, so I'll cover this just very briefly. There are 3 ways to get songs going here, either just playback audio. This lets you create an audio recording that gets saved to USB storage plugged in the back. Beyond just making audio recordings, you can also use this to stream tracks off a USB drive, say if you want to play along a backing track. The second option is also relatively simple. This also records a song as you play it, but rather than recording raw audio, this records MIDI notes. So you could later on play with levels or any other sound design parameters, and that will impact the song that you recorded. And then last but not least, the pattern tab gives you access to Montage's most complex sequencer. This lets you record loops for each of the parts and then swap those out based on different scenes. So let's say play scene 1, and we can jump to any scene we like, and all the patterns for all the parts for that scene load up. Now there's no way to step sequence patterns into here. You need to play them live into each part. You can, however, load up MIDI files or export this as a MIDI file, and you can create songs by chaining these to each other, adding more parts to the song, and you can then play this song start to finish. While there aren't any step sequencing controls here, you can edit notes in a variety of ways, but I think it's a bit tedious compared to a full piano roll style editor, which we don't have here, at least not as of the current firmware. So that's sequencing. Then a few miscellaneous features. There's a DAW control mode. This uses the Mackie standard, which auto-maps track names and lets you control things like levels and pans, but not device parameters, at least not auto-mapping device parameters like you can with Ableton Live. So you'll need to map these manually if you want to control plugin parameters. So that's DAW remote. I already mentioned earlier that you can load up multi-samples into here. There's no auto-sampling tool in here though. You'll need to use an external software tool like Sample Robot, which can auto-sample either plugins or hardware instruments and export a format that this supports. And it'll be interesting to see the plugin version of this and how it interacts with the synth. That's supposed to come out sometime in 2024. When it does come out, I'll either make a dedicated video or add my thoughts to the description of this video. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons for Montage M. On the pros side, I think that the combination of the vast diversity of sample and preset content, along with the 400 voice polyphony, means that you can put together soundscapes that you just can't on any other synth. And there's a broad range of examples, like this one, that are great examples of how to put together performances that are made out of multiple layers, including the use of multiple arps simultaneously. Let's taste maybe one more. And I could go on, but let's not for now. All these split and layering capabilities make Montage M a sound designer's dream. The Montage M is also very much geared, I think, towards performance. While it's not easy to get an in-depth understanding of the interplay between the different layers of performance, parts, and elements, and hopefully this video helped, but once you do, it has a pretty fast workflow for customizing factory performances or making your own, along with the ability to assign controls to tweak the parameters you want. The new ANX engine is a very welcome addition. The new sub-display and main display knobs make Montage M a much more hands-on experience compared to the previous versions, and I particularly like that you can choose a certain set of parameters on the sub-display, have that stay there regardless of what you do with the main screen. As far as polyphonic aftertouch goes, I think it's a welcome addition, but I have to admit that I found the other new features more useful, and I especially like that the implementation of the polyphonic aftertouch on this particular keybed, on the M8x, didn't compromise the excellent weighted feel of the keybed. That said, if weighted keys aren't important for you and you're used to synth action, I don't think the lack of polyphonic aftertouch on the M6 or M7 is that big of a deal, but that's just me. On the cons side, while the ANX engine sounds great, unlike the two other sound engines, you only get 16 voices of it. Some competitors in this segment have more virtual analog polyphony, so you won't get to enjoy all the layering effects of Montage if you try to layer too many ANX voices. Now that said, there are plenty of virtual analog sounds on the AWM2 engine. The sample-based oscillators here can make really nice synth sounds, and the sample parts also have filters, envelopes, and LFOs. So for example, all of these sounds are based on AWM2 samples, but they are based on samples as opposed to the detailed oscillator, modulation, and cross-mod options within the ANX engine. Then on the sequencing side, you'll find some competitors have significantly better tools to step sequence and edit patterns and modulation. Here you can only sequence what you can play live unless you import MIDI files you sequenced elsewhere. I also would have loved to see a granular engine here. One way around that is to multi-sample an external granular hardware or software instrument, but that obviously doesn't compare to having an actual granular synth on board. And then while the screen is more responsive than the previous Montage or MODX, it would have been nice to just touch a parameter and drag its values up and down. A few other things I would have liked to see here are a sampling workflow. Right now there's no way to multi-sample external software or hardware instruments directly from the synth, and you can't chop samples like on an MPC or machine or even some other workstations. Also, there's no undo except for when creating and recording patterns. It would be nice to see multi-level undo and redo. And one thing I hope they change, you can't currently edit a part once a pattern is playing. So you can change its parameters, but if I want to go ahead and say edit a particular part, you can't do that. As long as the pattern is playing, you have to stop playback, and you can then go ahead and edit the part. And then finally, while Montage M, especially the M8X, is built like a tank, it also weighs and costs like one. I'll put the weight specs on screen. It'll be interesting to see if at some point in the future Yamaha come out with a Modi X version of the M, though don't hold your breath, the lighter Modi X came out 2 years after the original Montage. So that's it for Montage M, a polyphony and multi-timbral beast. If you'd like to learn more about FM, virtual analog, and sample-based sound design, check out my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.